Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. It's been a little while since we've sat down and just discussed the topic straight out. Let's do that. I should do more of that, I think. People do seem to dig it. What's in a game? Slightly fancier, more referential way of saying what is a game. And something that I think that is worthy of discussion, especially lately. We've had an interesting few years when it comes to games development, and ideas about narrative, and the way to draw a player into the world, and not all of them have been good. This was inspired by a rather recent article on the Guardian's Games blog, which is actually a major UK newspaper. You may know the paper because it publishes an awful lot of the revelations from Edward Snowden. But in this case, it's an interview with the Chinese Room, the guys behind A Machine for Pigs, as well as Dear Esther, the narrative, quote, game, unquote. This came to my attention, actually, because it had a misquote from me. In fact, I think it was actually entirely made up. Towards the bottom of the article, Dan Pinchbeck, one of the two founders of Chinese Room, says, "We've destroyed the games industry, according to TotalBiscuit." Oh, that was an interesting thing to say. I'm pretty sure I've never said anything of the sort, but I don't want to talk about the article. I want to talk about what a game actually is, and this ties into the video I did a while ago on the subject of Dear Esther, but since experiencing Brothers as well as playing some of the more narratively focused games this year, such as Bioshock Infinite and The Last of Us, as well as Beyond Two Souls, I think it's worthy of discussion. And I would really like to get into the subject of what a game is, what it isn't, and how a game should actually address the player and bring them into the world without making them feel like they're simply a spectator for a virtual installation. This is a term that I've heard bandied about in regards to Dear Esther, and I would agree with the general notion of it. Dear Esther is not a game, in my honest opinion. It is a virtual installation. It is something that you tour through. You walk through it, you experience what they have to offer in terms of their story, and then you reach the end. Now, for me, that is not a game. And there are a variety of ways to define what a game is, but I'd like to get into my personal opinions on that, and also contrast it with the titles that I just mentioned earlier. I feel that if you want to be a game, as opposed to a virtual installation, or indeed what is essentially a computerized exhibition, a museum tour, you have to have some characteristics that are lacking from Dear Esther. One of those is the notion of a failure state. And some of you are about to jump on me and say, well, why on earth did you mention Beyond Two Souls? That doesn't have a failure state. That's only true in the strictest of definitions. The idea behind Beyond Two Souls is that you cannot basically die. You don't have to redo a section because you did something wrong. That doesn't mean, however, that it doesn't have failure states. It just doesn't have a binary failure state. You can fail, but you fail in a certain way. You don't fail in a way that forces you to redo the section. There are entire parts of that game that you will not get to see unless you succeed in previous sections. Not getting to see those parts and having a less than ideal result, to me, is a failure state. You have, as a character, failed in some way. But just like real life, failure does not always result in your death, and it certainly does not mean that you get a chance to redo it. You get to go over and just try it again. You don't. That's not the way that it works, and if anything, I think one of the greatest triumphs of Beyond, even though it has many other problems of its own, is the notion of introducing a more sensible kind of failure state, a more organic sense of failure state. Less gamey, less obtuse, less contrived, I suppose. One could argue, of course, there is contrivance in that game as well. The fact that it comes up with reasons to allow you to continue actually playing the game, that's potentially contrived. But if you compare that to something like Dear Esther does not have a failure state. The only failure that can occur in that game is the failure to finish it. And that, if anything, is an indictment, I think, of the problems that that so-called game actually has. The fact that you would not want to finish it because you simply weren't engaged by it is a problem that everybody faces when it comes to producing media of any description, and Dear Esther is absolutely no exception. I feel that a game must have an end goal, it must have an objective, but that's not enough, because you can say Dear Esther has an objective, it does. Getting to the end is the objective of Dear Esther. However, you compare Dear Esther to Journey, And what you will notice is the difference between the two is you get to the end, but one of those games will test you in some way. One of those games will put obstacles in your way. And Dear Esther never ever does that. Once again, that's tied into the idea of the failure state. You can fail within Journey. It's fairly rare. There aren't that many places in the game that really allow that to happen. But it's there in the same way that Beyond deals with the idea. It doesn't mean game over screen. What it means is that there are objectives which you can actually fail in some way, and it will result in a detriment to you. It may not even be a gameplay detriment. It may simply be a storytelling detriment, or maybe just some disappointment in yourself. But you can fail something. You cannot fail anything in a game like Dear Esther. And I feel you have to have those objectives, and you must be tested. Games are a challenge of some description. They don't have to be an extreme challenge. Not every game needs to be Dark Souls. But there must be some kind of challenge which you must overcome. And that is key to the game experience. That is why a game is different to a movie, because you are playing a character within a game, whereas you are watching a character within a movie. And if you look at the writing tropes of pretty much any television series, or indeed any movie, what does it have in common with games? Well, the answer is very simple. The overcoming, the act of overcoming some form of adversity is key to the narrative of almost every fictional television series, movie, and even book on the planet. There must be some form of adversity, and there must either be the failure to conquer it, or there must be the success in doing so. In the case of games, you are not watching a character overcome adversity, you are the character that overcomes adversity. That's the real strength of the medium. As a result, I feel that games have the potential and the ability to allow the player to experience an emotional range beyond what other forms of non-interactive media can actually achieve. Are we there yet, though? Absolutely not. And right now, we're in a time where we're struggling with the idea of how to deliver a story to the player, and we are making missteps along the way. Dear Esther, in my opinion, is one of the more extreme examples of that, and it's something that is full of ideas which also went on to affect Amnesia: Machine for Pigs in what I view as a very negative way, detracting from the achievements of the previous title. However, it's not the only game to do it, and I'm noticing some rather disturbing and insidious practices within the games industry over the past few years when it comes to narrative. What we seem to want from games, or at least what developers are trying to achieve, is parity with big-name TV shows, with big-name movies. They want to be respected in the same kind of way when it comes to delivering narrative, but so many of them seem to miss the point. You can deliver narrative in a very different way, and more to the point, you should deliver it in a different way whenever you can. What we're currently seeing, however, in a lot of big-budget titles, whether it be Last of Us, Bioshock Infinite, something like Max Payne 3, if you remember my video of that a while ago, I compared it to Max Payne 1 and 2, and I criticized its storytelling techniques because it takes control away from the player too often. And I feel that more often than not, it takes control away to the level where instead of being that character, experiencing what that character experiences, you are in fact an unwitting cameraman. You are watching from the outside. It's like there's a glass dome that is extremely transparent, but you're aware it's there and you just can't quite get through it. And in games like that, you probably never will. It seems like the game is almost begrudgingly giving you control, and only at times when it feels like it doesn't want to shove more of its narrative and its script writing down your throat. And that is a great weakness of something like Max Payne 3, and it continues to happen to this very day. I view it as symptomatic of increasing budgets and the attempts to try and bring the movie-watching crowd and the television-watching crowd over to the idea that games are a thing. I remember a little while ago there was an ad for Uncharted 3. And I think this personified the problem quite neatly. What happened in this ad was that the guy's girlfriend sat down on the sofa with a bucket of popcorn ready to watch, and he sat down and started playing Uncharted 3. The implication being that this was so photorealistic and this was so well acted and movie-like that someone could spectate it like a movie and enjoy it that way. And perhaps they can. In fact, there are several games where I feel you can absolutely do that. But unfortunately, more often than not, it does so to the detriment of the person actually playing the game. and the focus seems to have shifted away from the idea of you being that character, you playing that character, in favor of you watching that character go through some kind of story. And I feel that that is a weakness of a lot of modern titles, and it's something that we will hopefully slowly start to move away from. I like to bring up the example of Brothers because I believe that it is the best example of the marrying of mechanics and controls with narrative and storytelling. It is a game that understands what games should be. It is a game that is looking forward to the future, where games will be more than simply a bad movie with occasional interactive bits, which is often how I would describe game plots. That's what we're getting with a lot of modern titles. I'm sorry, but if you took the cutscenes of The Last of Us and you turned that into a movie and you watched that, then what I would say to you is, yes, you may be able to find some enjoyment from it. Yeah, there were some pretty good performances in that. Some of the voice acting, some of the writing is really, really good, and it has its moments. But compare it to a good film, or a good book, or a good television show, it doesn't even come close. Compare GTA 5 to Breaking Bad and tell me that GTA 5's writing, that GTA 5's delivery, and just overall plot can possibly compare to something like that. And you might say, well, how is it even possible to get to that point? Is that what we should be chasing? And what I would say to you at that point is, no, we should be chasing the Brothers' ideals. Ironically enough, the involvement of a filmmaker in the creation of Brothers was pivotal, I feel, to creating that kind of experience, which is strange because we've had quite a number of Hollywood types try to get into the games development scene and to get involved and start writing scripts and really get a handle on making games and being an influence in them. And more often than not, we have seen negative consequences come out of that. Some people like it. Please don't get me wrong here when I say, oh, you know, all those games are rubbish. I don't mean that they're rubbish. I mean that the way that they deliver their narrative is not something that I'm looking for in games. Maybe it's because I've been gaming for so long that back when I started gaming, it was all about the gameplay because there just wasn't really a way to tell the story. So I grew up believing that to be the right way of doing things. But if you look at the way Brothers does things, you see the future. How do you see the future, you might ask? Well, what am I saying here? You see the future because you have the idea of marrying game mechanics with character development. And the way that it does it allows you to experience adversity. You remember what I was talking about earlier, having to overcome that challenge? That is a game that does that. And in fact, it does it even in a very physical and tactile way, which is incredibly unusual. The idea of having to hold down the buttons as you climb a wall or you do various different physically challenging activities with your two characters, it makes your hands hurt. And that's deliberate. That's the really clever thing about it. It's not a poor design choice, it's a deliberate one. That feeling of struggle is something that you yourself experience in the controls of that game, which is absurd when you think about it because there are, in my opinion, no other examples of that ever happening. And maybe that's taking it to too much of an extreme. We don't need every game to be Brothers, but what we do need them to do is to look at the principles established in that title and think, how can I marry gameplay with storytelling while one is not battling for supremacy over the other? Because that's the real problem I have with a lot of games right now. The mechanics of something like Bioshock Infinite I've criticized before, but they are things that can be improved. It can be a better shooter. The mechanics of Last of Us are pretty solid, honestly. They really, really are. And there's a lot of strengths to that game. But every time it seems like you're trying to take control and you are attempting to enjoy the mechanics of the game almost begrudges you for it and says, you know what, we need to show them a bit more story now, so we're going to take the control away from you. Those are not bad examples, though. Those are actually some of the better examples where, honestly, you can get over it because everything marries together so well. It's still not good, and I feel that they need to evolve it, but it's not too bad. The really poor examples are things like modern military shooter campaigns. Battlefield 3 is one of the worst examples that I have ever personally seen. And it is a game that constantly takes control away from you, and you not only do you not feel involved, you feel left out. And it's insane to think about it, really. You're AI partners, I wouldn't even necessarily describe them as AI partners, they're AI actors. They follow a script and they're supposed to lead you through a museum where occasionally you shoot the exhibits. Every now and again, the game kind of treats you like a child, saying, do you want to sit in the front seat? Do you want to pretend to drive the fire engine? That's what those games do when they give you something like a rocket launcher for a pivotal scene. It's like, you take the shot, and nonsense like that. Almost like it's dangling a little piece of cheese in front of you saying, yeah, I know you've been patient for the entire meal, but here's a treat. Thank you for not eating the food from our plates, you loyal hound. The feeling of involvement in those titles is contrived in the extreme, and the limitations put on you are unreasonable. Games will be limited in some way. Of course, you can't do everything within them, but the games that realize their limitations and try and include the player as much as possible within them are the ones that do really, really well, in my opinion, when it comes to delivering narrative to you. Games have mechanics. Games have gameplay, as ridiculous as it sounds. One of the easy counters to the argument that Dear Esther is a game is the response, well, where's the gameplay? And then someone will ask me to define gameplay, and I'll point you to what I said before about the notion of overcoming challenges and having various failure states. Dear Esther is a title that I would have preferred to watch, not play. In fact, the act of playing it, to me, lessened the overall storytelling experience. I would have watched that as a machinima movie. I really would. And perhaps I might have even enjoyed it. But I was so frustrated with the complete lack of ability to interact with anything, and the fact that I was expected to hold the W button for about an hour as I went through this exhibit. It was torturous, and honestly, it reduced my enjoyment of the title in general. And it seems like a lot of games could learn from that mistake. It's a little harsh, I suppose, to call Dear Esther a mistake. I don't believe that Dear Esther is an influential title, and I do not believe it has inspired a ton of games to follow in its footsteps when it comes to how to deliver a story to the player, and I certainly don't believe that it is destroying the games industry. But we did see that some of the ideas from that game were transferred over to Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, and it did so to the detriment of the title. It's just symptomatic of a larger problem, a struggle to understand how to include the player. And more to the point, a struggle to understand just how important that really is. So many games simply ignore that idea. They feel that their big-name voice actors are more important. They feel that their scripted events and their wonderful set pieces, they're more important than the player. And I will always say to you, remember who is playing your title, and never, ever, ever claim that their experience is anything less than paramount. It is the thing that matters the most. And we do not play games to watch. We play games to be involved. We play games to play. Some people ask me, every now and again when I mention David Cage titles, why do I like Heavy Rain, but I don't like something like Dear Esther? And I have a very simple answer to that, and it's the same reason why I enjoyed The Walking Dead and I enjoyed A Wolf Among Us. There is a difference between a narratively focused game that limits its mechanics only to the absolute essentials required in order to effectively deliver that narrative, and titles which don't have mechanics at all. David Cage titles are still games. They are very narrative focused, to the point where it's obvious he wishes to create an interactive movie. And funnily enough, he doesn't really want to put any mechanical systems in there. Things like health bars, doesn't want to have anything like that. There won't be any score, there's no fighting system. You can't really necessarily call the QuickTime event fights a fighting system. It's, if anything, a substitute. The idea of QuickTime events within those games is to allow you some influence over the outcome of a situation. But that's not to say that these games are simply Dragon's Lair. They're not. They do have other elements to them, and they do encourage the idea of investigation. They encourage the idea of these sort of timed events whereby you have to achieve a certain number of objectives in a certain period of time. I remember the opening to Farenheit being one of the greatest moments I think I've ever played in video games, because you were on the clock and you had to think in a way that was unusual. Another moment fairly early on in that game also struck me as just being absolutely phenomenal. There's a moment where you wake up, you're kind of covered in blood, and a policeman knocks on the door, and you have a certain amount of time to hide the evidence. That to me was absolutely fantastic, and I didn't feel like I needed any kind of system along with that. And as David Cage's games have continued, he has stripped some of those systems out. If you look at, say, Farenheit, it actually does have bars. It's got kind of a sanity bar, a mood bar, as it were, and the further you go through his games, the less of that actually exists. But it's okay to have minimalistic gameplay elements as long as they still provide a challenge and they give that sense of inclusion to the player. In fact, David Cage, strangely enough, seems to hate the idea of not having you included, even in some of the most mundane things, like making breakfast or opening doors and sitting down. He doesn't want to show you any of that. He wants to let you do it. Even if it is mundane, I appreciate the effort to include me as a character, even if my character happens to have Ellen Page's voice. While it may not have a fighting system like, say, The Wolf Among Us, I appreciate that it wants to allow me to affect the outcome of that system in some way. The way that Telltale does things is actually reasonably similar to the way David Cage does it. If you look at the ideas behind it, they do it in different ways. Both of those games have the immediate in mind. They really want you to make decisions on the fly, and that's how they keep their pacing up. In the case of Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us, they do it in a dialogue tree system, whereby you only have a certain amount of time to make a decision. And there are certain moments in that game which do the same kind of thing, where you have to make that call pretty damn quickly. And that keeps you involved. In fact, I feel that sucks you in very effectively. And that element of choice, even if it's just binary, is far more than an awful lot of games allow you to have. And it means so much. I come from a time, I think, when reading Choose Your Own Adventure and fighting fantasy books was the way to experience choice in gaming outside of pen and paper role-playing. And as a result, I really appreciate making informed choices in games and feeling like my actions have mattered in some way. And there are so few games where that's actually the case anymore. Bioshock Infinite is incredibly guilty of this, although thankfully it manages to justify it in its narrative by saying that no choices really matter, the idea of constants and variables. Nice justification, but it certainly didn't take away my feelings that I was simply being led along this particular theme park ride, and my sole duty here was to just shoot a bunch of people in the face. That was a game that, in my opinion, got a little bit too full of itself, and was so busy trying to show you just how amazing the world is, and ooh, look at this political idea that we tossed in there, that it forgot that you're a player. You're not a student in a lecture hall. You are supposed to be able to experience this in your own way within the bounds of the game, and I really don't feel that Infinite did a particularly good job of that. That is a game where the storytelling and the mechanics are in conflict with each other. They are battling each other. Whereas a title like The Wolf Among Us or indeed Heavy Rain have this uneasy truce going on that seems to work just a little bit better. Concessions have been made, and the game understands exactly what it is. Not every game has to tell story in that way. I'm certainly not suggesting that that is the case, but I do feel that developers need to understand the difference between a game and a virtual installation. They need to understand that narrative is best experienced in games, not shown or told. Limiting your player is not the way to do that. There are certain boundaries, of course, that must be respected, but frankly, you should not be dragging your player through your story by the nose. It's certainly a bit of a cliche, but it doesn't mean it's inaccurate. The games industry is still growing up. We're going through this awkward teenage phase now where we're trying to work out what we want to do with the rest of our lives, and there are a bunch of guidance counselors that are directing us in various ways. The influence of our parents, that being television, books, and movies, are all trying to pull us in a particular direction, trying to assert their dominance and saying, this is the way that it should be. And then you've got your awkward teenage peers as well, all trying things differently and occasionally getting into trouble. But the wonderful thing about that is that there are so many different ways to attempt it and still create an enjoyable experience. Please do not get me wrong, I am not condemning all of those games that choose to show rather than allow you to experience, because the game is more than the narrative, and that's just the wonderful thing about video games, isn't it? You couldn't say, oh, well, this movie is fantastic because of its cinematography, even if the story is just absolutely rubbish and the acting is abysmal. You couldn't get away with that, but you can get away with it when it comes to video games. You can have a game that is so strong mechanically that it can get over its story limitations, and that to me just shows how diverse, flexible, and enduring this medium can really be. There is so much potential yet to be unlocked here, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we get from games in the next 10 years. My name's been TotalBiscuit, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.